welcome to another Scottish Ninth Age battle report. This is a Scottish Knight battle report. I realised I haven't been using my forum tag in the previous battle reports, so this way if anyone wants to find me on the Ninth Age website, they can do. So this was game 2 of the Northern Wastes tournament in Durham. This was Kingdom of Equitaine versus Kingdom of Equitaine, which was an interesting matchup for me. First time I played against a rival Equitaine army. And this was on table 2, so this was, or what would have been table 2, we were technically on table 1. This would have been a perfect opportunity for me to try and set myself up for this tournament. I had to try and win fairly big in order to give myself a shot, so I went fairly all out for it, and you'll see how that turns out. Here is my army, unchanged from the last time if you've seen the previous battle report, because as Lord Tremendous is so keen on saying, to change it would be cheating. And here's the detailed list. And here was my opponent's list. So you can see quite a few similarities here between our lists. Both gone for the Duke and the Hippogriff. His was built very much more for damage on the charge. We had a bit of discussion about this. It was probably pretty close as to whether his Duke could kill my Duke on the charge, but if he failed, then my Duke would grind his down in a challenge over a number of turns. So we had a bit of discussion before we ever got into this fight. Otherwise, he has a smaller unit of Grails. He has 2 big blocks of Peasant Levy, which are going to cause me problems if I can't break them. He's got 2 trebuchets instead of 1. He's got the Green Knight. So there are a few differences, but there are also quite a lot of similarities. And it was very interesting to see a mirror of my army. And here's the detailed list. Here's the table that we would be playing on, and as you can see, there's a huge hill in the middle of the board, and there's quite a few bits of impassable terrain, forest, and then those 2 sort of markers you can see are the objectives that we placed. So the bottom left, you can see that was the objective I placed, and then above it next to that wall was the objective that my opponent placed. Then you can see the magic that we drew. I was fairly happy with mine. I got Awaken the Beast, but more importantly I got the Totemic Summons, which is always useful to me when there's war machines on the table. And here you can see my opponent's spell list, which was pretty extensive because he'd given his wizard he'd given his Duke on foot, who wasn't his general, unlike mine. He'd given him the wizard's hood, and so he had access to a few extra spells. This is a technique that I have to say I quite enjoyed, and I made use of in later games, as perhaps you'll see in some of my later battle reports. On to deployment, and you can see he has castled pretty heavily in the corner, sort of taking one of the objectives and a clear line to try and get hold of the second objective. I've spread my army out a bit more. I've tried to put my cavalry one behind the hill away from those 2 trebuchets, but also setting them up to sweep round. And my plan was roughly to get round the hill, possibly round the impassable terrain, put some pressure on the flanks, and hopefully I would make some ground up and be able to sweep across and claim all the objectives later. My opponent took turn 1, and here is his position after movement. You can see he's moved quite a few things forward. He's moved the Green Knight forward to chaff up things, I think knowing that he was safe from a direct cavalry charge. He was quite confident with that. Moved one of his levy blocks round to move towards the objective. Shooting and magic didn't do a whole lot, but he started what would be the first of quite a few miscasts and killed off one of his brigands before doing any damage to my army. Unfortunately, with access to Druidism, he was able to keep trying to bring some of them back, but I was able to dispel this time. And that's turn 1 for my opponent. Turn 1 for me, and as you can see there were no charges, but I did start to move forward. I moved up the levy and crusaders to press against the other levy to try and hold on to that objective to the bottom of the map. I moved around most of my cavalry, putting my aspirants up onto the hill. I moved forward the archers to try and tempt the Green Knight into charging them or doing something with them thinking that it would leave him in a position where I could countercharge him, probably with the aspirants or with the Pegasus Knights. I really didn't want him lingering around in front of my lines. And I also moved some things back just to try and put them outside of the Green Knight's charge distance, knowing that some of my smaller units would probably suffer quite heavily if I had to fight against him. Against his Duke, who had moved up to the front of his army last turn, I put my Duke into a 17-inch charge distance. I thought it would be tempting, but not guaranteed. I probably made a mistake there. I probably should have pushed him to give the charge, declare the charge, and then hope to survive and win that way, or support potentially with some static combat res. But yeah, I probably left that one a little bit too long. Magic, I failed to cast Totemic Summons, but I did get a Chilling Howl aura off, which means a little bit harder for him to shoot at. My Trebuchet shot at his Pegasus, but nothing particularly interesting happened there. And again, nothing with the archers, so that was the end of my turn 1. Turn 2 for my opponent, and he charged his levy towards my levy to try and hit them and take them out of the game, but fortunately came up short, so I was quite happy with that. I realised I'd left them in a fairly vulnerable position there, particularly with that big block of levy with so many ranks nearby. The rest of movement, the Brigands moved up into the woods, Brigands with the Reliquary in them, but also with the Duke on foot and the Damsel as well. So there were a lot of things going on in that unit there. The Reliquary obviously giving its bubble to the 2 levy units nearby. Duke and the Pegasus switched positions. I think the Duke sort of realised that he didn't really want to be involved in the fight with my Duke. It's an issue I should have pressed, and we'll see how that goes. And the Green Knight decided to make a real nuisance of himself and hide right in front of the peasant archers, so I couldn't get any charges on him with any other units, and the Pegasus archers, the peasant archers were a little bit too wide to allow for anything interesting. So that was a good move from my opponent. It was well played. Magic, he managed to miscast, trying to re-roll hits against his Trebuchet, but no damage to the Brigands because they saved on the ward. And in shooting, both of his Trebs misfired. One of them out of the game, and one of them couldn't shoot for another 2 turns. So he was very unlucky with his Trebuchets. I can only claim a lot of luck in that part of the battle. My turn 2, I have to apologize because this is where some of my videos started going missing due to accidentally being overwritten. But I think these are fairly accurate. The levy and peasant crusaders both charged into his levy. I thought that with the peasant crusaders bringing a bit of combat skill that this would be enough. We'll see how it goes. The archers charged into the Green Knight, and this was I probably was limited in terms of the options that I had available to me, but I thought that the archers would probably hold for a turn and then break on his turn, which would potentially leave the Green Knight in an interesting position. We'll see how the rest of movement was just moving further forward with all of my knight units, trying to get them into a good position, bringing my Pegasus unit right round, giving a decent arc on the Green Knight, but also looking out towards some of the other units. Really, the mistake I made here, I feel, was not splitting my knight units far enough. I think I could have set up a bit better on the flank charges and pushed the levy to expose its flank to one of these units, but it was still early days, I suppose. Magic, I brought on a Totemic Summons just beside the Trebuchet, which could still shoot, which I was quite happy with. Shooting, Trebuchet scored a hit on the bandits and pretty much decimated them, left one of the unit alive, plus the Reliquary, the Damsel, and I think the Duke, although he may have moved into another unit by that point. Combat, and this is where things got interesting. So the archers in the fight against the Green Knight, the pride of Equitaine, the spirit from beyond the veil who arrives to defend the land against all comers, they did a wound to him, and he did nothing. And at this point, I'm looking like this is Christmas and Easter and every other possible festival all at once. And then the horse kicked out, and it killed an archer. And the Green Knight saved by his horse. Except this is where I'm going to probably complain about this for the next 100 years, assuming I live so long. He should have died, and I can only blame the rush of checking combat resolution in a hurry, because thinking about the combat, he was a banner bearer, he did a wound, I had a charge, a flank, I had a wound, and I had a big flank because all I needed was a single rank to get that, and I think I mistook it and thought that you needed 2 ranks for that. It's a mistake I've made before, and he should have lost by 2 combat resolution, he should have taken 2 wounds, and he should have died. And I will never ever stop being frustrated that I didn't calculate that properly. So Luke, if you're watching this, I wish I'd known that. So, but I didn't. He took an extra wound, and he had 1 left, and he sat there in front of my 9-strong archer unit, who won the combat. Meanwhile, in the other combat, the much worse combat, the opposing levy killed an inordinate amount of my peasants, and I just did nothing back, nothing effective back, which was frustrating. I thought that the Crusaders would add a decent amount, and here's where I realized the mistake that I had made, and probably many people watching it have also seen the mistake. I did not put my general into leadership range. And that was a frustrating mistake to make. I know that the Peasant Crusaders need the general around. I know that their stubborn combined with a rerollable leadership 9 test is, is essentially unbreakable. And I just didn't do it. I have no excuse. I completely forgot. And so when they broke the peasant levy on my side, who ran off the board, and they also broke the Crusaders because I failed my leadership 7 test, which is not overly unlikely. So entirely my fault there. But it left me in a very bad position, as the Crusaders I didn't go too far, but they did end up in front of lots of other things, and suddenly that flank is looking very precarious. Turn 2 for my opponent, and things started to get pretty interesting at this point. So he charged into the Crusaders, who had to flee. He charged at my Pegasus Knights, who I decided should also flee. That did leave my damsel there, but there was no more redirects coming her way, so I was confident that she would be fine this turn, and yet the levy just fell quite far short. No surprise there, after the Crusaders had to bounce through a number of units, and the Pegasus Knights were already a bit of a distance away. In other movement, the last remaining brigand moved into the woods, and he would be a thorn in my side. The Duke moved a long way over to the other flank and put himself in a very different position. The Pegasus Knights moved forward to chaff the aspirants and stop them being able to charge into the Green Knight, I presume. And the trebuchets started moving. Always hilarious when this happens, but with one of them unable to shoot and moving away down the flank, and the other one moving more into the center of the board, I cannot blame my opponent for making that choice. It's the smart choice. And meanwhile, the Grail Knights turned round to look towards my totemic summons, and he's going to have a pretty damn good turn in order to survive this particular encounter. In magic, he cast a spell to heal the Green Knight using Druidism, and he miscast it, but by this point he had moved his Duke into the Peasant Levy along with the Reliquary and the Damsel. So all he did was kill a couple of peasants, and in return he regained 2 wounds on the Green Knight. I like to think that those peasants were sacrificed in order to give the Green Knight back his wounds. I mean, he's clearly not a very good Green Knight, this particular one. Shooting, lots of archers shooting, but no wounds. And in combat, this is another ridiculous round of combat. Absolutely absurd round of combat. The Green Knight killed 4 archers. That sounds reasonable. That sounds much more like what you would expect. Only the archers did 2 wounds to him. Maybe we'd made a mistake. Maybe these archers were actually noblemen in disguise pretending to be archers. Or maybe the Green Knight was actually just a goblin on a horse, and the Equitaine had made a big mistake in terms of thinking that this was their savior. But whatever the reason, I almost won the combat again. Had he had another round like last time, it would have been a whitewash. But I trying to remember how the combat res. He did 4 wounds. He's a banner. I had a flank and probably forgot the big flank. I think I would have lost, but I still had 5 guys there, so they didn't. He didn't break me. I stayed, and I can't quite decide whether this was a good thing or not, but it's a thing, and it's an interesting thing. And why are we playing the game if not for interesting encounters? My turn 3, and things do not get particularly better here. I aimed a charge with the aspirants at the chaffing Pegasus Knights, thinking that maybe I would redirect into the archers. I'm not really sure what I was thinking, but they fled and I failed to redirect, and so I just wandered a little bit forward into a really awkward position, nowhere useful. The rest of my movement, I put round all of my big knight units into the flank, thinking that I would put some real pressure onto the levy over there. I put my duke round there, and that was a mistake. Looking at it now, it seems very obvious, and for some reason I was thinking that this moving around the flank would be great. What I should have been doing was putting my duke right round the other side of the hill and putting pressure on his duke and forcing him to either take the charge or to back off. It was a big mistake not to do that. Obviously it's a lot easier looking at the map to see. Meanwhile, my peasant crusaders and my Pegasus Knights both rallied, no surprise there, and they set themselves up. I was a bit concerned about the bowman. It was a long distance charge if he took it, but it was certainly had me concerned. And the totemic summon with its random movement went straight into the trebuchet, which could still shoot. So that was pretty good. I was quite happy with that. Magic, and I brought on another totemic summons next to the peasant levy, and I did his breath weapon on them for 4 wounds. Might have been a bit of a waste. Maybe I should have saved it for combat res later, but it was a few dead. Trebuchet shot at the levy but did nothing, as per usual for this game. And in combat, the Green Knight finally killed 3 archers, and they weren't going to hold any longer, and so they broke, and he ran them down, and that's in a really awkward position, and at the worst time possible for him to break those. So the fact that it took him 3 rounds to break them ended up being a benefit for him in the end. Not going well. In combat, the totemic summons made short work of the trebuchet and broke it and ran through, but not far enough to put it safe from the Grail Knight, sadly. Turn 4 for my opponent, and lots of things going on here. The Grail Knights went into the totemic summons as expected. The Green Knight made a charge onto my damsel, and I thought about fleeing her, but he had such a head start. I think he had 2 inches, maybe 3 inches head start on the flea. I just thought it was a bit too much. He charged with, I think he may have charged with the Duke. Yes, he charged at the Duke, with his Duke at the Knight's Aspirant who fled off the hill. I didn't really want to be taking a front charge. I think he probably would have failed the charge given what he rolled to redirect into the trebuchet. I think he would have failed, which is frustrating because yeah, that would have put him in a much better position for me, but that's not what happened. There were lots of movement with the characters leaving the peasant levy and moving back over into the brigands, which was a smart choice given that my character killing Duke was lining up a charge into the peasant levy if it had come to that, and he'd have made short work of those characters. The brigands, I think they'd had a couple of guys brought back through druidism. So yeah, there were a number of things going on. Oh, and the levy did try a charge on the bowman, but came up short. It was a fairly long charge. I was quite happy with that one. I tried and failed to dispel the Oaken Throne at the beginning of this, which was frustrating. So he cast Summer Growth to regen the wounds again on the Green Knight. And again, he miscast. There's so many miscasts this game, and the miscasts were ridiculous this time. He killed his Duke. He did a wound to the Reliquary, a wound on the Damsel, wiped out the rest of the unit, which left the Reliquary and the Damsel, and they failed a panic test and they ran. Honestly, I think his magic did more damage in that section than I'd done for most of my turns. So yeah, it's a shame it wasn't as general, but even so, that was pretty lucky for me. Shooting did very little. The Grail Knight beat the Totemic Summons. The Green Knight beat the Damsel, but she didn't break. Sorry, there was no wounds, so it was just a case of charge and a banner. She made her break test, and so that combat was a push. My turn 4, and this was more or less make or break. For me, I had to try some pretty big moves in order to make something useful out of this game at this point. So I went for it, and movement got a little bit tricky, to say the least. So my Duke charged over the levy to hit the Pegasus Knights, who chose to hold, I think possibly thinking that I might not make it, but also fleeing would have put them in a rough position with a few other things in the way. Also, I think possibly the redirect would have put me into some more interesting things. The Knights of the Realm went into the front of the levy because the Knights of the Grail went into the archers. My thinking was, and it's not going to be clear on this, that I could have overrun with the Grails and I'd have clipped with the corner of the Grail unit into the levy. Now, I think having looked at the rules since this, there would not have been a way for me to have the flank charge. So this probably wasn't a good tactic at all. But at the time, we thought possibly due to old rules that it was possible to have a sort of corner to corner, and so I didn't need to close the door or reform or anything. I think ultimately the way that the combat is supposed to work, you need to be aligned, and if you're not aligned, then you make movements to try and align, and if you can't align, then you don't get into combat. So I suspect that this wouldn't have worked. However, the way we ruled it at the time was that I would have been a flank charge. I wouldn't have had many models in combat, but the flank charge would have been there. So all I had to do was break the archers and overrun into the levy. And with 6 Grail Knights and a handful of levy attacking sideways to them, I thought if they made it, this was a shoe-in break for the levy. And then one of the Grail Knights tripped on a wall and died, and my heart just sank. So I ended up with 5 Grail Knights into the flank of his levy, which might as well have been one kid with a stick for all the difference it made to the 50-odd peasants. So frustrating. One failed DT test. I did have to take 4 in total, so I can't say that it was unlikely, but it was a 1, and then I had a 5 on ward save, and I just hoped that I could have made it, broken that levy, and suddenly things would have looked quite different. As it was, no such luck, and yeah, a number of things did not go particularly well this turn. Peasant Crusaders and Pegasus Knights both went into the levy. I didn't really know whether I would expect that they would break them. I did manage to use magic to give +1 strength to the Peasant Crusaders to up their combat usefulness. And yeah, that was going reasonably poorly. In combat with the Pegasus Knights, the Duke was challenged by the unit champion, killed him, but did no overkill. I mean, that was just rubbish. He should have been murdering that Pegasus Knight badly. They passed their leadership test. I think we may have forgotten the -1 leadership for fear, but hey, if we did, it was my fault. And they also passed their leadership test to reform. Looking at my notes here, he saved 3 out of 5 wounds I did on the ward save. So it wasn't me being bad, it was him being ridiculously good at making his ward saves. Instead of making 1, maybe 2, he made 3, and that was probably enough to keep them in place. And yeah, the Pegasus Knights did very little to the levy. The levy did 2 wounds back and killed 6 Crusaders. My Duke killed 2, my Castellan killed 1. They were now both in the Peasant Crusader unit. The Peasant Crusaders killed a few, the Summons killed a few more, but they were still well steadfast. I mean, I did my best to try and take down enough, but I just wasn't close. And in the Damsel versus the Green Knight, she took a wound and failed her break test, ran away, and was chased down. And yeah, at this point, things were going pretty badly for me. And possibly thanks to Mercy, I've run out of records of this game, and I think we were running short on time as well. So this is the last image that I have, but I can pretty much run through what happened. A number of things reformed. His Grail Knights went into flank my Grail Knights and did some horrendous damage to my poor Grail Knights. Killed about 4, maybe 3 or 4 on the charge. The levy were just grinding through through my Knights of the Realm, who couldn't really take that face-up punishment. My Duke eventually killed those Pegasus Knights, but far too slow to make any real difference. I reformed him, and I had 1 shot at charging his Duke over in the other fight, but I failed, and so that was an irrelevance. His Duke chopped through my Pegasus Knights. He also killed my general, and at that point, I think the Green Knight reformed and took out the Trebuchet. I had very little left. I was nowhere near taking the objective, and though I'd had a couple of moments where things were looking all right, at this point it was a done deal. So totaling up the points, and I had made 1,345 points, and he had taken 2,856 points off me for a difference of 1,511, which was a 14-6, but with the secondaries both belonging to him, that took it to a 17-3, and I can't really complain. This was pretty well deserved on his part. Anyone who was at the tournament will know that Luke went on to win it, and so losing against the eventual winner, not a bad place to be, really. I feel like I could have made it a closer game. I think there was nothing wrong with my list. There were a number of things that I did wrong, not splitting my cavalry to force his flanks, and also not pressing his Duke with mine. I think those were the 2 biggest mistakes. As for gameplay, I have to put it down to not counting up combat resolution. If anything, you always double check your combat resolution when it's an important combat, and things could turn on it. Also remember the rules, which is always a good bit of advice. So in summary, it was a good game. It was an enjoyable game. Luke was a very, very good opponent. I can't really have any complaints about game conduct or how it all unfolded. My own mistakes cost me quite dearly in this game. I don't know if I could name any units that performed particularly well. Everything just seemed a little bit under par today. Even the Peasant Crusaders, who are usually my go-to, guaranteed do the job, just weren't on form today, and partly that was my fault for not supporting them in the right ways. But yeah, this was a good game. Sadly, it dropped me down the rankings for the overall tournament, and hopefully I'll be able to do a third battle report with the final game, although I might be missing quite a lot of footage for that one. So we'll see what I can do. Thanks all for listening, and anyone who is in Scotland or visiting Scotland and wants to get some games in, then do please follow our 9th Age Facebook page. I'll put the link in the description down below, and also follow us on the 9th Age forum, and we do a monthly meetup in Stirling, which anyone is welcome to attend. So thanks everyone, and see you again soon.